Okay, and now on to our keynote speaker for ISMIX 2025. I'm very, very, very honored to present my good friend, Brian Ferguson, who has graciously agreed to join us all the way from Nashville, Tennessee, and be our keynote speaker this year. You'll be very impressed by what Brian has to say because he's made a career out of studying what we do and how to make what we do better. And he's very equipped to do that. Brian is the CEO and founder of Arena Labs. And Arena Labs is a company that is pioneering the field of high-performance medicine. It's the first company to apply mental and physical principles that world-class athletes, elite military teams, and creative performers use and bring them to healthcare workers on the front line like all of us. And so we've been engaged with Brian probably for the last 7 or 8 years. I first met Brian at one of our 21st century meetings, and I think folks like Eric and Sloan and Wendell and Louis and Byung, if you're still here, will recognize Brian from our trip that we did once to San Diego, where he kind of tried to get us ingrained, get a bunch of heart surgeons to understand the ways of the Navy SEALs. Brian was a Navy SEAL early in his career, and he was heavily involved in emerging technology and human performance at the time, and he got us to go into the Pacific Ocean with blindfolds on and rely on our fellow colleagues. I could show some pictures, but I don't want to embarrass anybody in their wetsuits and such. But it was a wonderful and very enlightening experience. He learned us how to hold our breath and stay down underwater for a long time. And all those things are obviously very important in terms of building your physical and psychological endurance. Brian is also the co-founder of Liminal Collective, which is a unique company focused on enabling humanity's boldest endeavors in space travel, deep sea exploration, and advancing the science of human creativity. He also has a Master of Science from the London School of Economics and is on faculty at something called the Singularity University in Silicon Valley. That's something I'd advise you to look up, which is very interesting. University in terms of what they do. And he's also leads the Limits of Human Performance Scientific Symposium at the Santa Fe Institute on Complexity. So without further ado, I don't want to take time from Brian's presentation, but he's here to talk to us about human performance, and he's got a lot of insight. So Brian, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. This is the first time someone's engaging you from the stage, I suppose. Really, really humbled to be here. I know all of you, I always say in medicine, the biggest challenge is getting everyone in the same room at the same time. And that's certainly true in a hospital, but I know to come all the way across the country and the world, it's really fun for me. Dr. Ball has become a good friend. There's many colleagues in the room. I'll tell my story in a bit of sort of stumbling into your world. But my work in healthcare started in heart surgery and just tremendous admiration. Someone was asking in the back, I said, when I get to do these meetings, whether it's a grand rounds or an event like this, there's a certain desire to pursue mastery for yourselves, for your teammates and your patients that I really admire. Dr. Balke mentioned, so this event was, this is actually where we met. There's several folks in the room who are here, and it's one of my favorite stories because what's tricky about cardiac surgery is there's not when someone's seasoned in their career, anyone who's a master craftsman, when you get to the top of your craft, it's hard to make you anxious again. But all of us grow and we're kind of at our edge and we feel uncomfortable. And so using just simple breath techniques in the water is a great way to get there. And this is one of my favorite photos. Actually, I think Dr. Balke's on the far right, and you can see us in the pool there just doing some basic breathing. But any of you know Dr. Terry Yao, who's not at this meeting, but he's a cardiac surgeon at University of Toronto. And Dr. Yao came down and said, I'm okay. I don't want to get in the water. And so one of the teammates kind of convinced him. He puts a wetsuit on. And the next thing you know, Dr. Yao is fully in the water. And one of the things we get into is you sort of continue to ramp up a little bit of stress, just like your residency trajectory. You start early in life and you get more stress and you get more capable. But at the end, we start to use this sort of dynamism where you have a partner who's splashing you and throwing water just to make you uncomfortable, and you're just really trying to focus on your inner calm. And you look over, and Dr. Yao, who's kind of smaller stature, is literally like body slamming his partner in the pool. This classic cardiac surgeon competitiveness. But nonetheless, I just, for today, I think in that spirit of pursuing mastery, it's one of my favorite things, is what is it, everyone in this room came in to the world of healthcare for a desire to steward human health in some way. And you have this dedication to mastery that I have always admired. But in that, there's also the question of how do we build high-performing teams? And what does it mean to build a high-performing team in a digital age? And this is actually one of my favorite questions, because when you start to stack technology inside the operating room, it gets increasingly difficult to understand the human system. So if you guys wouldn't mind indulging me, I'm going to ask everyone to stand up, and before you do so, take 30 seconds, and the person next to you, I'm assuming everyone here is either works directly on the clinical side in the OR or is regularly in the OR. Would you exchange with the person next to you, what is your biggest challenge day to day in the OR? Is it technical? Is it the human system? What is your biggest challenge? And just take 30 seconds. If everyone minds standing up and exchange, I'd be grateful. Let's go ahead and do that. All right, we can grab our seats. Thank you. If you didn't figure out already, that's a hack to change the energy. We're sitting all day here. But also, if you're someone who said you have no challenges, then it's a different conversation. I saw some people kind of straight face. What are, I'd be curious, a couple of answers, if a volunteer, something that surprised you that someone said to you. Someone in mind. What was yours? Yeah. His. You want to go another 50 years in surgery?
I want to increase my ATP.
Increase your ATP. I love it. So, but bottom line, which was a really good point, which is how do you go longer in a craft? And it's actually a really important subtext because
I'm only 86.
you're only 86. That is impressive. But it is, when you think about how much time all of you put into training, this is actually, it's an important subtext. As we get more stress, this is something I'm going to talk about at the end. How do we actually manage longevity? You think about the value of you as an asset as a surgeon. How about one more? Anyone else over here? Other members of the team. That's perfect, and that's actually a really good segue. Because what I'm going to talk about is it's actually, I think, what fascinates me about the future of cardiac surgery as a humble observer is it's not a discussion about technology. So I've used this photo a lot. It's one of my favorites. Anybody know the backstory in this photo that hasn't seen it? Yes. Do you know where it's from? Poland. Are you from Poland? Okay. It's nice that we're in the Europe, Asia. In the States, it's less common that people have seen it. But I love this for two reasons. Number one, this is the 1987 National Geographic Photo of the Year. So this captured the world. When you look at Dr. Religa, postured there in the back right-hand corner, you see his fellow collapsed in exhaustion. And it becomes this fascinating marker. The context on this photo, this was the first heart transplant conducted in the Eastern Bloc in 1987 in Poland. And it was said to be impossible. And if you think about the conversation we're going to have today about the future of heart surgery, minimally invasive procedures, technology, this was wildly advanced in 1987. But again, you look at that fellow collapsed, and then what I love, if you look at Dr. Religa from the shoulders down, what do you see? Exhaustion. But look at his eyes. What do you notice about his eyes? Yeah, he's almost willing that patient alive. and we call that the inspired soul. And every single person in this room, in a moment in your life, made a decision to go into healthcare and to steward human health. And it's a beautiful calling, and it's rare. What we know is when you stack technology and the responsibility that you carry over time in an increasingly fast-paced world, if you don't have the right tools for yourself and your teammates, you end up in the back right-hand corner. It becomes this really interesting metaphor for how we think about the intersection of advancing technology and advancing human health. Just quickly, this little skinny guy who could use a meal is me in the 1990s in Cleveland, Ohio. And many of you will know Cleveland, Ohio for the Cleveland Clinic. That happens to be where I grew up. And for a long time in my life, I thought that I was going to join your ranks and get to work in some part of healthcare. And this was actually me shadowing an orthopedic surgeon, part of a middle school project when I was in middle school. And the reason that I had that passion was this woman on the left. And that's my mom, receiving her registered nurse degree sometime in the 1970s. As Dr. Balke mentioned, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and for those of you who are familiar with sort of the US cultural landscape, there's a lot of musicians and hipsters in Nashville. There's also a lot of thrift stores where you can get old gear. My dad's 1970s plastic leather coat would sell for about $2,000 US in a thrift store. But on the right-hand side of the screen is my kitchen table. And growing up, I viscerally remember my mom loved her work in the OR. And she'd come home and talk about the day, her patients, what happened. And on the rare occasions things went wrong, or the rarer occasions when a patient was lost, you could viscerally feel that. Now, I ended up not going into medicine, and I had the privilege of serving in the military. And what was interesting about that is the first thing I had to learn to do was manage my own fear and anxiety, but ultimately learn about the connection between the mind and body. And how do you operate in an increasingly difficult landscape? And what are the tools I use, to the point up front, to extend longevity for my own body and mind? Now, my last station was in Hawaii, in a unit that was operating underwater. And what's interesting for those of you who scuba dive, you would know that you see bubbles coming out of this mini submarine. When you're on mixed gas, that means I'm not drinking, I'm not eating food, and if I'm operating at night, it's totally dark. And from a human factors problem, this is really challenging. And so we were trying to understand what cultures could we learn from where we could advance a human system mentally and physically. And so I had this dream job where I was traveling the world, learning from other high-performing cultures, and how did they extend longevity for their own teams. And so I end up, so anyone who's been to a Cirque du Soleil show, and so it's a fascinating entertainment experience, but the precision required of the mind and body night in and night out is actually fascinating.
Now, through hard
This
work
is,
and discipline,
you turn that down just a little bit.
Come on, he says.
Is anybody familiar with this run?
Has the hand of history on his shoulder.
Yeah, this is Eliud Kipchoge breaking a 2-hour marathon. We worked with Nike at the time. To run a marathon in 2 hours, you run at 4-minute, 33-second mile, which is in kilometers very fast. See him meeting his wife. But what Nike did with technology to understand the human system was absolutely fascinating. And then I got to collaborate on this. This was a skydive from space. Many of you remember from 2012. And this was Felix Baumgartner, an Austrian skydiver, took a capsule into the stratosphere, went 40 kilometers above Earth, and then he's looking to skydive back to space. And the reason that this was a collaboration between NASA and Red Bull to look at, again, a human system under pressure and to learn about life-saving systems and moving into space. This is Felix standing on the edge. So you hear him say, "I'm coming home." Still makes my stomach drop. He made it back safely nonetheless. But I ended up in your world. And I ended up at the Cleveland Clinic at the Heart and Vascular Institute. And life kind of came full circle for me because I'd grown up in Cleveland. My mom was at a hospital just up the road. And I got to see the sophisticated world of the modern OR, particularly in the minimally invasive space. I was fascinated by the technology and the team. And what I want to talk about today is that in that journey, two things happened. But number one, I started to see how interconnected people who are pursuing mastery are. But the other is that all of these domains, whether we're talking about sport, the creative arts, medicine, have this challenge of understanding how do we build world-class teams in an increasingly sophisticated world of technology. As we put more technology and more data and more decisions in the same space, it's really difficult to understand how do we invest in the human system to the challenge. I would suspect that if we really dug in for all of you, the biggest challenge day to day is the human system around you. And so my work now, as Dr. Balke mentioned, is for the last 9 years been working with some of the best thinkers, minds, and teams across healthcare in the US, parts of Canada, and here abroad. And I'm absolutely fascinated by this question is what would it look like if we provided you and your teams with the same tools, training, and coaches as other people who have to work under pressure in a high-stakes career? Because if you want longevity, every person in this room, the reason you're here, if you think about it, is you are in the history of the world some of the most talented, technically proficient people to work in cardiac surgery. We get kind of lost in how simple that statement is. But if you think about a global population of people who are working, when I see what's happening right now, just the talks over the last 2 days, it fascinates me. And you kind of forget that. But as an asset, the question is, how do we make the right investment for ourselves and our team to get the most longevity and the most efficacy? So I want to step back and talk about this idea of teams and technology or hybrid teams, because when I met Dr. Balke, this is what fascinated me. So in the early 2000s, it was really the first time that you started to see robotics show up. And there was this discussion about AI in the future. You know, yesterday I saw, I think it's Dr. Srivastava, is that correct? Just fascinated. When I watched that, him showing a video of a heart surgery being done 300 kilometers away from where the robot was, just for the layman like myself, the future feels like it's here. But what's interesting is I think this idea of pursuing mastery and building the teams around that future is changing. And so what I want to do today is offer, going back 9 years to when I met Dr. Balke, observations I've seen in your ORs, some of your colleagues' ORs, around how we build high-performing teams. And I say this humbly because I am a visitor to your space. So in the early 2000s, this is a drone pilot used to survey landscapes. There's all sorts of applications of drone in the military and agriculture. But however a robot in the sky is being used, right? When you take a pilot out of an aircraft and you put that person somewhere else, you now have a different communication system. In order for this person to communicate with either someone on the ground, someone in another part of the world, you have to fundamentally change. You're not in a cockpit together anymore. You don't have real-time communication. And so this starts to radically alter the landscape. Simultaneously, this is the F-35, one of the most advanced aircraft. Built by Lockheed Martin, it's used around the world. It costs about $100 million. In the F-35, when you read about the amount of technology and everything from cameras to artificial intelligence, it's almost overwhelming. What's fascinating, this is a helmet worn by an F-35 pilot. This costs $400,000. Uniquely outfitted, and you can't get your hair cut, it's got to fit a certain way. What's interesting is the visor on the helmet was overlaid with augmented reality. And you could look at your wingman, you could look at all different types of sensors. When this aircraft first went live 10 years ago, it had to be grounded. And the reason it had to be grounded, does anyone want to guess? What's that? Yeah, the pilots were overwhelmed. Cognitive load. And this is a relatively new term, but technology sounds more and more advanced and sophisticated. But if we don't think about the human system using it, we start to run into real challenges. Now, we get outside the world of the military, where a lot of these things early on start to be designed. Anybody F1 fans in the room? It's usually more radical. There's a lot more here. It's good. Anyone know the record for a pit stop? 1.9? Anyone want to go lower? 1.7? 8? Yeah, someone nailed it. So it's currently 1.80. This was 4 years ago. This is the Red Bull team, who since has been passed up by McLaren. I always find this to be a magic trick. So imagine, you're changing 4 times on, and this is going to happen. Don't blink. .91 seconds. But in order to make that happen, just like your ORs, there's an entire data infrastructure and communications infrastructure behind. Again, as you overlay more technology, these F1 teams, McLaren, Red Bull, have had to change the way they communicate, the way they integrate data. This is going to be real outside the norm of a normal cardiac surgery meeting. This is a wave on the north shore of Hawaii. It's called Jaws. People all over the world come to surf this wave when the surf is big enough, once a year. Now, it is about a 60-foot wave, and this was said not to be surfable 20 years ago. And what's fascinating is these surfers had to reimagine how they communicate. They use jet skis to get enough speed to get into this wave. So this is a surfer named Kai Lenny, who we worked with 7 years ago, surfing one of the biggest waves in history. That also gives me anxiety. So the point here is when we think about teams of tomorrow, on the heels of all the just fascinating presentations, technology, when we think about whether we're talking artificial intelligence, robots, whatever part of minimally invasive cardiac surgery you work in the last decade, there's been an immense amount of technology in your world. And that is fundamentally changing, not just in medicine, but in sport, just the world writ large. 3 important things: how we communicate, how we train, and how we measure the human system. And I want to get into what that looks like. So when I start to think about this question, this is what I love talking to Dr. Balke about, many of you, because very much like what I saw in the military and what you see in sport, the best teams in the world recognize the landscape is changing, and that means they've got to change right now the way they're training for themselves and for their teams. So what I'd like to do today, just for a few minutes here, is I recognize not everyone here uses the robot, but everybody here is using some kind of advanced technology. And I want to use Dr. Balke's OR as an analog or sort of a parallel world to what I know many of you deal with day to day, both for yourself, for your team, and the technology there. So again, when I ended up at the Cleveland Clinic back in, this is, I think, 2015 now, so about a decade ago, it was fascinating to see what I'm going to call the traditional OR. At the time, of course, lots of advanced technology, but it was not a robotic OR. I had not been in one yet. And so when you look at that environment, and I'm going to say traditional in the way of, before you started introducing advanced technology, the 3 things that I'm always fascinated with: what's the environment look like? How do we think about the execution, the clinical application of skills? And then how is that team interacting? Right? This is just like if you're on a sports team or creative arts team, these are the things we look at. In about 2017, interesting this wasn't time, but just to Darla's presentation previously from Intuitive. So up until, I left the military in 2015, the next couple of years, spending a lot of time in operating rooms all over the country. And in 2017, I got 2 different phone calls from different healthcare systems in the US. And the phone call was essentially, hey, we've started a robotic cardiac surgery program, and it's struggling. Would your team come in and work with us and just watch? Now, again, I'm an observer, but there's things that are very clear. And when initially at the Cleveland Clinic, the first couple of times that I was ever in the OR, it was very clear to me, you could feel the precision there. And as we started to work in cardiac ORs around the US, you could start to see when a team was working well and when they're not. This is just pattern recognition. But in 2017, both of these environments, a few things started to be clear. Number one, there was some degree of friction. There was a challenge with the technology, but I felt like I was missing something. I couldn't put my finger on why these programs weren't working, and what was the friction we were observing in the robotic OR, in these cardiac surgery programs. And right around that time, and I showed that photo from the start, was when I met Dr. Balke and a number of the colleagues in this room. And so for the first time, I went in the robotic cardiac OR. Now, this is a video of Mackenzie, who is Dr. Balke's prior PA, but this video was taken in about 2018. And I know that you've all seen this, but what fascinated me as an observer was philosophically, this is a totally different landscape. As an observer, this OR looks wildly different. The visual systems, the 360 awareness in the room, and then the surgeon is now almost in my mind removed from the surgery physically, which is fascinating. So I became enamored with, and our team started to look at what's happening here and what's different. And so where I've become particularly interested in the 10 years since, and you all know this, but it's worth almost in a simple way pointing out, that you are witnessing this rapid evolution from the left side of the screen to the right. And it's happening, I know, at different stages and phases, depending on where you specialize in cardiac surgery. But when I'm in Sam's OR, first and foremost, it goes from a hierarchy where everybody is circled around a table into one that is collaborative. And if you look at any team that moves from hierarchical to collaborative, we have to change the way we communicate. Because I can no longer just say, here's what I want you to do, because I don't have you right next to me, and we don't all have the same situational awareness. The other thing that's really interesting is the environment. It's because you've got a screen, you don't have as much light, you want the lights dimmer, and that becomes fascinating. We're gonna get back to that in a minute. But what I'm particularly interested in is the bottom two, is the team itself is now in different positions. And when everyone is circled around the table, in some ways the people around the operating table have a clear understanding of what's happening, but those who are not are often trying to hear or get context. And in any high-performing team, we want what we call shared consciousness. How do we build a shared mental model of what's happening here? And what was particularly interesting is that Dr. Balke uses a Quail headset system. And so it's a Bluetooth system, and suddenly people are communicating point to point. And again, as an observer with no technical understanding of what's happening, I had full situational awareness of every phase line of that procedure. What was interesting is that as people came in and out of the room, I could tell that anyone stepped in, they had a shared mental model. And so this starts to become very interesting. But what I found was fascinating is that people were not asking this question. When I said in 2017 we got those phone calls, this is what was missing. And I think if you take nothing else away, the provocative question I'd ask all of you to think about is this one. How is the way that you recruit, train, and operate your team changed? And I'd say in the last decade. Because what we started to see is both of those hospitals that were challenged by their programs had taken the exact same team from that traditional OR and put them in that new model. And there was a ton of friction around how people communicated, the way they were trained, the way they understood context. And so when we start to see teams that are succeeding in medicine, in these advanced technological environments, are thinking about the human system in fundamentally different ways. How are we training them, and how are we developing people? Because what we need today in our OR in terms of talent around us is different than what we needed 10 years ago and what we're gonna need 10 years from now. And so what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is make this tactical. And because I think any keynote, if I come in and I could give everyone a sunburn and we could be inspiring, but it's ultimately, what might we think about differently? And how do we start to tactically think a little different and learning from other disciplines? I would say when I think about the digital age, this is not about technology we started. This is how do we think differently about the human system? How do we invest and train our own people differently? So I want to hit 5 quick points here, and I've got examples of each. And at the end, I'd love some questions. But when I think about a tech-enabled team that is high-performing in healthcare, and observing Dr. Balke's OR and a lot of yours around the country, the first thing is this idea of finding an asymmetric advantage in your environment. So the thing about technology that you see in the military, in the creative arts, and sport, a lot of times we try to use it to solve problems. But when we put more technology in, it gets harder to control the environment because people are focused on data, on other screens, on other things that are happening. One of the things that I love, this happened several times, is that when you go into Dr. Balke's OR, he will say, at some point, can we bring the lights down? But what's fascinating about that, you can feel it in here, of course, people, why the lights go off. But it changes the energy of the room. In the last couple of times I've been in there, I can bring it back up, there's been a moment, and I'm gonna show you a cardiac signature of his in a minute. But I was there last week with our team, and there were 20 people in the OR to start the case. Some of those people were there as reps. We had a camera crew in there for filming a documentary. You had people to learn, and there's screens everywhere. And so the ability to control the environment, and what always was so interesting to me, is that when you go into a room see the human system start to change the way it's interfacing. And this feels sort of overly simple and trivial, but when you think about the power of this as an asymmetric advantage, when you use the lights to control the human system, one of the things I'm always interested in, we go into an OR and there's residents or young learners, you can feel the frenetic nervous energy. And one of the ways you change people's energy is by changing the environment. And when technology gets overwhelming, you want to change the way the human system's interacting. So what's your asymmetric advantage? That's one. Two, not all roles are created equal. Are you guys getting that feedback? I apologize. The mic's kind of kicking here, but. Not all roles are created equal. Invest and train precisely. If I said wisely, that would be condescending, because I don't know what a wise investment is for all of you. But precision. So one of the things we hear often, understandably, is people are frustrated because there's not a reliable team every day in the OR. Talent moves in and out. There's a lot of turnover. And at the end of the day, every single team, I do work in the States with an NBA team called the Brooklyn Nets on data and physiology. And the Brooklyn Nets, you would think they've got a massive payroll. They still struggle with trade-offs on who to invest in. In every hospital, I know that human capital is a huge challenge. But even when you have unlimited resources, not everything's going to be perfect. And the question is, what roles are most important? And as technology gets more advanced, it actually makes certain roles on your team even more important. Again, one of the things I find really interesting, I showed that video earlier of Mackenzie. This is Juan He, who is currently in the room. I'm going to give a shout out here to some of the PAs. But one of the things that I find so fascinating, as an observer, watching a case, a robotic case, and there's again an analog here for all of you, but Juan He, number one, is invaluable in that room because she's serving as a conduit. This idea of a shared mental model, Dr. Balke's understanding, she has to anticipate what he's doing. Now, of course, I know that's the role of a normal scrub relationship. But there's another layer here, and what I was talking to Sam about when we had dinner last week, is as technology is advancing, we don't even have language for some of the stuff that PAs are doing. Because she's watching a screen and engaging in a virtual environment, and then having to make a tactile, physical decision with her hands to bridge two worlds. And it's an unbelievably sophisticated job. And this is not a job you can just pull someone off the street and have them start Monday. And I know that's not most jobs in your OR, but when we think about a cascade of what's most important, teams that are making clear investments in fencing off with your partners, with the hospital, of where we know we have to have the right human capital, it makes all the difference. Because if everything in the OR, in a minimally invasive environment with more advanced technology, is the same, you risk turnover where it can be an Achilles heel. And I find these relationships, again, I challenge each of you on the flight back to think about what are those roles in your OR that you can't give up. And Caitlin is here as well, who was not in these photos, but is the counterpart to Juan He. I don't know if any of you follow Kai-Fu Lee, but he was one of the early, before AI hit the knee of the curve. He's one of the sort of godfathers of modern AI, both from a philosophy and a technology perspective. He's at Microsoft, at Google, but he wrote a book on AI. And one of my favorite models in that book is he talks about where human capital is going. And I think this is a perfect example about things that are rote or can be optimized do not need compassion. That's where artificial intelligence comes in and makes our jobs easier. And you guys see this certainly in radiology, I'm sure in parts of your day-to-day. But in the top right-hand corner, jobs that require a high degree of compassion and a lot of creativity. That's where we really need the human system. Now, if you're here as a surgeon, you all know that's going to be a long time before that goes away. But certain roles around you that require an equal degree of compassion and strategic thinking. The Latin of compassion is compati, to suffer together. Who is it that can suffer with you in your OR? And I'm sort of half kidding, because there are times when you are suffering 6 hours into a case, I'm sure, and you need to know someone's there. But the person who shows up and you know can almost be that extension of you. It's really important. Third, control for cognitive load. It's your greatest risk. So cognitive load is a term that came out in the 80s in education theory, which was how much can we learn and how can we learn as we start to overlay more learning modalities. But in the last 20 years in sport, in the military, and the creative arts, cognitive load is something we have to think about all the time. Because when I look at pictures of an OR 20 years ago versus today, you see more screens, there's certainly more noises, there's just more happening technologically. And back to that F-35 example of the plane having to be grounded, as you stack more in your OR, each of you, if you're leading a team, you're probably used to that, and it's second nature. But when I come in as an observer, you can immediately tell when someone's overwhelmed. And you know this, just technically when you're training a resident or fellow, when someone's overwhelmed, breathing cadence changes to their chest. They start to move faster, they're anxious, they don't make good decisions. But the same thing happens when we put too much information on people. And in distributed teams, and one of the things, the extreme cases in the robotic OR, but on Sam's team when I'm watching, and there was actually last week in a case, a resident had come in anesthesia, and the resident was quickly overwhelmed. What was interesting is that the cognitive load overwhelm was brought back because that team is all on Bluetooth headsets. And so Juan He, as the PA, noticed and could anticipate that the resident was struggling and gently started to ask, hey, what's going on over there? How you doing? Didn't need to yell, had a distributed team, very calm voice, helping that anesthesia resident catch up with the team. But when cognitive load, when someone starts to get fixated on a screen and they're overwhelmed by data, as leaders, you have to have the ability to bring them along. And that's actually a deliberate skill. Now, again, the way that Dr. Balke's team does it is with, by the way, I'm giving a shout out to these companies. I clearly have no investment in any of these. But I do think how we communicate really matters. And it's fascinating watching the role these headsets play, because you can't always tell, especially if you're the lead as a surgeon, you can't tell when someone is getting overwhelmed. But if someone on your team recognizes it and can bring them along, it's a superpower for mitigating your risk. Fourth, this is oversimplified, but more technology generally means more pressure. And I challenge you to tell me one thing in your life that technology made you less stressed. You may think, but there's a trade-off probably somewhere. I can book my flight faster in 30 seconds, but I've got 75 choices. I end up taking 2 hours doing that. It's an analog for everything. As we put technology in place, there's a learning curve, and there's more risk because we now have more data and more insight. So one of the things we talk about in terms of human performance, how is the individual system, is that in your OR teams, everybody's an N of 1. You may have a single parent with 3 kids at home that doesn't sleep a lot, and what they need to manage their stress is different than your young resident. But if you teach people on the team how to self-regulate, that again starts to radically mitigate your risk. Because back to my point earlier, what fascinated me and continues to fascinate me is hospitals are putting, whether it's robots or more advanced technology in place, they're not thinking about how that human system needs to train. At a very basic level, one of the things that always fascinated me, when you look at military, when you look at the world of the creative arts, Cirque du Soleil, Olympic, and any elite athlete, there's 3 things they do in the modern world because they know that it's more stressful. Number 1, they use sensors, some sort of wearable sensor, to teach people how to manage themselves, understand when they're stressed, understand how to improve rest and recovery, because those are superpowers to show up with a clear mind and physical readiness. The second is, what are the tools when I'm overwhelmed or when I cross a threshold that help me reset? This is the idea of recovery. And then the third is, how do you focus on regeneration? I recognize all of you, back to that inspired soul we started with, this is work that's not for everyone. It's why I always feel humbled when I come here. The vast majority of the population could not sit in this room, being on call, up all night, the dynamism of cases. But with that, especially as we put more technology and you feel more stressed, the ability to downregulate not yourself, but for your team to do that is, again, a superpower. One of the ways we think about that now, I'm not going to get into this, but this is adapted. When you take the world of pro sport, the creative arts, and the military, they look at these 3 buckets. So let's take on the left there, does everyone on your team know how to regulate stress? And those 3 buckets below, if I'm that resident that walked into Dr. Balke's OR last week and felt overwhelmed, as an observer who doesn't understand that resident's job, I could see that overwhelming physiology. Again, that shallow breathing cadence moving fast. That resident had not learned self-regulation techniques. But these things, again, when each person in your OR knows how to come in and manage themselves, it takes a massive amount of load off you as a leader of trying to regulate other people. And then finally, mastery is a long game. So we started, it was a perfect response, we didn't plant that question, but saying, I want to go longer. Everyone in this room, you've devoted your life to a calling, that service archetype. And so naturally, you want to go as long as possible. And you know the longer you go, the more impact there is within reason. But to the other side of the coin, again, not planted, this is not about technical skill. It's about you as a human system and the human system around you. One of the things that happens all the time, this is about 6 months ago, 1,000 clinicians in a room, was talking about the difference between endurance and performance. In an endurance model, we don't have the tools we need to recover, to manage energy. And so we have a series of stressors. We can call that over just our residency. We can call it over a 40-year career in cardiac surgery. But we don't notice it. We're not adapting. We're just slowly losing energy. And so at some point, the question is, how long can I go? And I just say, I don't have the passion I once did. I can't do this anymore. In a performance paradigm, this is not about doing more cases. And this is sort of antithetical to say, but it's sometimes about doing less. But people who are high performers that understand how to show up over the long game of life as a master craftsman or craftswoman, they know the tools they need. They still have stressors. They still have the long call and all of the things that are challenges in your life. But they grow from that. And it's not how long can I go, but how good can I get? A room of 1,000 people 6 months ago, I said, how many people are in a performance paradigm? Not a single person raised their hand. These are all clinicians. The amount of times I've had a cardiac surgeon ask to go out to dinner and sit down and say something like, I'm just exhausted. I don't know how I'm going to keep going. And that was actually the same problem that showed up in pro sport in the military that forced this bigger conversation of what are the tools I need to continue to manage myself so I can pursue mastery, not just over the short cycle of getting through residency, but have an impact on a career over 30 years. This is a gentleman named Dr. Kirk Parsley. Dr. Parsley had actually been in special operations in Navy SEAL, went back to medical school, and he started to study the impact of stress on the military. He published a paper in February of 2020 in the International Journal of Psychiatry and Medicine called Operator Syndrome. Operator syndrome has become very prolific in the military. And if you'll indulge me, operator syndrome may be understood as the natural consequences of an extraordinarily high allostatic load. The accumulation of physiological, neural, and neuroendocrine responses resulting from the prolonged chronic stress and physical demands of a career with military. And you could cross that out and put on the front lines of surgery. When you look at that cascade, and this has ended up changing culturally. How do we think about if we want to have longevity, we have to think differently about the tools we need and the way that we're equipping people to go long. The term allostasis, initially, fascinating how a lot of these concepts are not more than 20 or 30 years old. But allostasis is the idea that beyond homeostasis, we can actually go through stress and evolve and improve. Use stress, we grow. But allostatic load, Bruce McEwen first published on this in the 1990s, is that when we're in a constant state of stress and we don't downregulate, that comes at a biological cost. And so when you look at this graph, if you think of yourself entering the field of healthcare, whenever that was, whether we think about 5, 10, 30 years ago, there was a set point for homeostasis, physiologically, a resting heart rate, a heart rate variability, a signal of your nervous system, and a sleep architecture, all of which were, let's say, reasonably healthy. But as we build stress over time, if we don't downregulate and bring ourselves back to homeostasis, we start to build this debt. And whether that's, again, 10 or 20, that delta on the top right, that new altered set point, our heart rate's elevated, we don't sleep as well, that difference is called allostatic load. But investing, there's tools to understand how do I minimize that? Because we know that allostatic load, similar to the paper I just shared, has a massive cost on longevity and efficacy. So I want to end here because I think this is really interesting. Dr. Balke indulges me, and on occasion, I think he's always interested in this same concept for himself, using a wearable sensor. And so one of the days that we had been observing him just said, hey, let's take a look at your data. So this is just his very simple heart signature throughout the day. And these devices, of course, they're not clinical grade devices. Some of you have an Apple Watch, some of you might wear a ring, But they are now powerful enough where they give you very basic insights, and basic data about yourself can be fascinating. And what I love about this is two things. So number one, on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a case that had been starting in the morning. I mentioned there was 20 people in the OR. And at some point, it was clearly starting to get frenetic. And I believe the proper term is docking the robot. So you're now getting everyone focused to start a case in a very important way. And as the robot was being docked, it was just the sort of frenetic nature of the room. And Dr. Balke said, quiet in the room. And he, just when you've been in his room enough, you don't hear that tone of voice often. But he said it just enough where everyone focused. And so that signature on the left is physiology building. Probably just the frenetic nature of getting the case started, a lot of people, a lot of things are happening. The self-awareness to feel that is called interoception. That's something we develop as we get more sophisticated in any craft. But the awareness to know how to control the room and bring that energy down is powerful. The second part on the right, and what's interesting, if you look in the middle of the screen, over on the left-hand side, that signature, that's during the case. And we see this generally that about a 25 to 30% elevated heart rate when a seasoned surgeon is in flow. That flow state of I'm focused, I feel good, and then you're getting up and down a little bit so you see some spikes. What is interesting is the far right circle. Later in the day, Dr. Balke is proctoring for someone who was not seasoned and so was an early learner. And for those of you who are more sophisticated in the room, your challenges are not what they were when you were a resident. They're going to be leadership challenges. They're the stressors that come with teaching someone or trying to bring someone along when you're responsible, but you have to give them responsibility. I know this is not necessarily profound. You all know this innately. But when you see that signature and you know how to manage it, it becomes really powerful. And so to end, the provocation I'd offer all of you is that over the next decade, when we look at minimally invasive cardiac surgery teams, I would argue the best in the world, number one, have a deliberate talent strategy. Who is the person on the team besides yourself that needs to be invested in? How are we recruiting and training those people? Two, see self-regulation as a vital toolkit for clinical excellence. One of the things I say all the time, just to be provocative, is the least important part of patient safety is the patient. The least important part of patient safety is the patient. Because if I show up completely depleted at the expense of myself, I just simply can't offer the clinical excellence I'm looking for. When you teach people on your team how to self-regulate, that starts to drive fundamentally different interactions with the team and outcomes. And then lastly, regularly redesigning operations. As technology, again, just watching the last 2 days of presentations, the speed of change right now is almost overwhelming. And there are going to be some stage gates where you're going to have to reevaluate how do we think about the way that we run our operations and the way we communicate in order to be efficient and effective in this technologically overwhelming world. So again, I know I'm super humbled, grateful to Dr. Balke, the team here, many of you who are friends. If you do have questions, want to challenge or follow up, I hope I've challenged you in some way, but I know this week is wildly valuable for each of you. It's very humbling for me to get to share some of the time, and I just want to say thank you to Dr. Balke and the team here. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you very much. That was quite exquisite. We're running late, but I think this presentation is so intriguing that there's got to be some questions. There's got to be some follow-up. Is there anybody that has one or two questions that we can engage Brian in, and there'll probably be some outside discussion as well. Having my heart rate shown up on the screen was not the greatest moment there, but I think we all get into that same phase when you're training somebody. Your heart rate is high. When you're doing it yourself, you know what you can do, you know what your limitations are. But when you're trying to proctor somebody or be, watching somebody operate, it does get our heart rates up. Michael.
Michael from Sydney, thank you, great presentation. Do you have a methodology for incorporating personality types into those type of team interactions?
Yeah, so the question is their methodology for personality types. So we don't do this right now. If I was, you're going to ask me to design the ideal sort of recruitment program for the way the landscape's evolving. I do think that personality assessment is important, and then teaching someone how they need to evolve. One of the things Dr. Balke and I have talked a lot about this shows up in any of these crafts. When you're doing something innovative and new, if you don't bring people along and use the right tone and communication, people say you're dangerous or you're a maverick because they get anxious. So you have to know how to be collaborative and to use the right tone to help people understand and sort of coach them along. I would say, generally speaking, seen again and again, in these more sophisticated technology environments, the ability to communicate with collaborative inquiry in some way and to be comfortable with that. One of the things I find that's interesting when I'm listening to Bluetooth sets, it's not just Dr. Balke who is helping teammates along. Because of the way that communication is set up, and of course the team is more advanced, you have an overall landscape where people are asking questions. I actually, one of the things that was sort of funny for me as an outsider, at some point in the case, things were moving quickly. This is a case last week. And Dr. Balke came on and said to Wan Hee, "Are we forgetting something, young lady?" And there was a point in the case where something had been skipped, but it was not like it was sort of a fun way to bring someone along. And I think it just makes the team lighter. And so you get more of this back and forth. But I do think that's impressive and important.
Eric, who was probably in one of those pictures. Go ahead, Eric.
I was in that pool a number of years ago, and that was one of the most provocative and interesting meetings that I've ever been to. So thank you for that, and thank you for being here again this year. One of the challenges that I think we face as cardiac surgeons, unlike some of the other teams that you showed, high-performing athletes, F1 teams, and so on, is that we can't necessarily control our team. In some cases we can, particularly those of us in this room, potentially having a smaller number of people on our specific teams for minimally invasive or robotic cardiac surgery. But in general, we often don't have control of who's there. And it could be a different scrub nurse, it can be a different anesthesiologist, it can be a different PA. And so every day could be a completely different set of people, different flow states, and so on. What are your suggestions to control an environment that's continually changing in front of us?
Thanks, Dr. Lair. This is I know the biggest challenge. I'm naive about it because it is different. There's two things that are different. You guys you're working 24/7 within reason, and your talent pool is more dynamic. The two things that I've come to believe, number one, is what are the roles you can control for? What I've seen in most institutions, again, because you're in this room, you are driving high economic and clinical value for your institution. And so what I see is really talented leaders figure out, where do I want to give and take? I can't have everyone in the room that I want all the time. So what are the roles I want to make sure that people are ensuring I have personally that takes some of the stress off the table? This gets back to why I think the PA is so important in Dr. Balke's OR. For each of you, I think there's a different element of that. So I think there's a strategic leadership conversation on resourcing with the hospital. I recognize that's easier said for me on stage than done. The second component is I really believe there's culture and standards. Not all people, but when you talk about a high-performing team, people come into work in cardiac surgery, even the hourly paid technician, people generally want to be a part of something excellent. But in order to do that, you have to set a standard for them and a culture. And so this gets back to asymmetric advantage. When I see certain surgeons who do something in a timeout that reminds people that what they're doing is excellent, just changes the tone a little bit. There's ways to get attention that I think fundamentally change how a team interaction operates. The best leaders I've seen are very clear about the culture in their OR, even if somebody's new. Again, I recognize that's easier said than done, but I do think as technology advances, that the only way that these teams can be successful is for hospitals to make specific investments, not just in you as the surgeon, but the one or two people around you who are equally valuable in terms of that team function.
Thank you.
Just a comment, and I like your self-regulation word. And when you have a complex situation happens in the operating room, and I was not a robotic surgeon, but when something's not going well, what I always did was just get out of the room and get your next lieutenant to take care of it for a while, and you regulate yourself, come back. Mm-hmm. And what do you call that?
A strategic reset.
Reset, okay.
Yeah. And again, when you look at, if all of you heard that, but when something's really complex and overwhelming, there's always a time, I mean, you see pilots do this where they pass over controls, you see athletes do this, but it's a strategic or a tactical reset. When you're in the tactics of something, as a leader, when it's overwhelming, what is often most important is to pull yourself out. And so you need someone you can rely on. I saw Dr. Balke do this a couple of times more just able to trade off, but gave controls over. But when you can do that in complex situations, it allows you for a minute to get to that higher work loaded cognitively. This is, the FAA has a lot of data on this. This is, what led to a lot of crashes is people got focused and they needed to.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Brian. It was a great session, and a round of applause for Brian.